She survived 30 hours of labor, but the wet bedsheet that came after childbirth cost her everything she thought she'd fought so hard to protect. If you've ever watched a woman blamed for what her body couldn't control, don't skip this story. The first time Rita Etim wet the bed after giving birth. She cried harder than her 3-month-old son. She woke with a violent gasp, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Her body froze, slowly. She looked down at the dark silk sheets beneath her, cold. Her husband, Jinwoo Lau, head of the Lau syndicate, was already gone. On his pillow lay a single silver cufflink, polished to a mirror shine, left behind like a forgotten coin. Rita threw back the heavy blanket, her hands shaking uncontrollably as she grabbed the edges of the soiled silk, frantically trying to strip the mattress before the sun rose. She glanced at the carved wooden crib where 3-month-old Daniel slept peacefully. "Just sleep a little longer, my love," she whispered, her chest heaving in silence. "One day, we'll wake up and forget to check." Heavy oak door swung open with a sharp click. The head housekeeper froze. The silver tea tray in her hands tilted. A single porcelain cup slid across the tray and shattered against the marble floor, hot dark tea pooling across the white stone. Neither woman moved. Rita took a breathless step forward, hands raised. The housekeeper looked at the dark stain soaking into the imported silk, then toward the grand corridor where the sharp, rhythmic tap of Madame Lau's cane was counting down the seconds. "Madam will have me dismissed," the woman whispered, her eyes fixing on the broken porcelain. Rita grabbed the older woman's calloused hands, placing them over her own chest. "Then let the blame fall on me." Housekeeper felt the violent rhythm of Rita's heartbeat. She slowly withdrew her hands, stepped back, and closed the door without a word. Heavy footsteps thundered through the grand hallway, the crowd parted. Madame Lau walked into the room. The matriarch looked at the bed once. She did not raise her voice. She reached down, picked up the jagged handle of the shattered teacup from the floor, and squeezed it until her knuckles turned white. A thin drop of her own blood bloomed against the porcelain. She didn't flinch. "Take them," Madame Lau said quietly. 2 servants rushed forward and yanked the heavy sheets from Rita's hands. Rita reached out, but a tall bodyguard slammed his forearm across her chest, pinning her back against the bedpost. Moments later, Rita was forced onto the second-floor grand balcony overlooking the courtyard. Madame Lau stood beside her, rigid as iron. On her command, the servants draped the soiled silk sheets over the marble railing, hanging them like a flag of absolute disgrace. Down in the courtyard, the entire estate ground to a halt. Armed soldiers stopped in their tracks. Drivers froze beside luxury cars. Gardeners dropped their shears. Everyone looked up at the dark-skinned Nigerian woman pinned against the railing. An elderly gardener quietly removed his cap, pressing it against his chest. A young maid lowered her eyes, her hand trembling against her apron. Nobody moved. Madame Lau leaned close to Rita, her breath cold against Rita's ear. "My mother dragged me by my hair into this same courtyard when I failed my first trial," she whispered, her voice devoid of anger, only a horrific, ancient certainty. "I bled on these stones so this family would survive. You will not weaken what my pain built." Slap, Rita's head snapped to the side, her skin burning. Standing near the balcony doors, Attorney Choi adjusted his silk tie, watching the scene with calm, motionless eyes. He didn't laugh. He didn't frown. He simply checked his gold pocket watch, calculating the exact moment of total breakdown. Heavy, authoritative footsteps shattered the silence. Jinwoo Lau stepped onto the balcony. Rita looked up at her husband. Jinwoo's hand twitched toward his jacket pocket, where a small bottle of post-labor nerve oil sat wrapped in cloth, bought in secret 3 nights ago. His fingers tightened around the glass bottle until it cracked in his pocket, oil and scent soaking into his coat lining. He did not pull it out. Madame Lau turned her head slightly, her gaze locking onto her son. "The council is watching the gate, Jinwoo. Choose." Jinwoo lowered his eyes. When he raised them, his expression was a smooth, dead mask. Rita dropped to her knees, reaching out until her fingers caught the hem of his dark trousers. Jinwoo stared straight ahead. He slowly took 1 step backward, letting the fabric slip from her fingers. Dr. Kang stepped forward, adjusting his glasses. His posture was stiff, his eyes fixed firmly on Attorney Choi, who gave a single microscopic nod. "Mrs. Lau's condition indicates severe, incurable neurological decay. She is unsuited for the clan." Upstairs, a baby's cry echoed through the open window. Jinwoo's jaw flexed once. He reached into his coat, pulled out a fountain pen, and signed the black divorce folder held by Attorney Choi without reading a single line. "No," Rita screamed, shoving past the guard. She sprinted up the marble staircase, driven by pure instinct. She burst into the nursery, scooped 3-month-old Daniel into her arms and pressed her face into his soft neck. 2 heavy guards kicked the door open, grabbing her arms and twisting them back. A maid snatched the baby from her arms. Daniel's tiny fingers tightened around the bright Ankara fabric of her dress. The guards hauled Rita backward. One tiny finger slipped, then another. Daniel's fist came loose, leaving a small piece of torn Ankara clutched in his tiny hand. They dragged Rita down the marble stairs. Her shoulders slammed into the framed gold wedding photo on the wall, sending it crashing to the floor, the glass shattering directly across Jinwoo's face in the portrait. The front doors swung open into a pouring soul downpour. The guards threw her onto the wet asphalt outside the iron gates, tossing her battered suitcase into the muddy gutter. Rita pressed her palm against the freezing iron gate. High above, through the second-story nursery window, 3-month-old Daniel's tiny hand was pressed against the glass, holding the red Ankara scrap. The iron gate slammed shut with a heavy metallic clang. Rita lay in the freezing rain, mud staining her skin. She did not scream. She pressed her face into the wet asphalt, her chest moving in silent, agonizing spasms. 7 years later, a black luxury sedan pulled up outside a modest apartment building in Itaewon. Attorney Choi stepped out with 4 enforcers, marched up the cramped staircase, and kicked the door of apartment 3B off its hinges with a single heavy strike. The guards swarmed the room, weapons raised. Standing by the small kitchen counter was Rita Etim. She did not flinch. She set her hot mug of tea down on the wooden counter with absolute stillness. Her dark tailored suit was pristine. Her eyes were flat, calm, and empty of fear. Attorney Choi noted the steady placement of her mug. "You've changed." Rita didn't look at the armed men. "Where is my son?" Attorney Choi pulled a silver pocket watch from his vest, the same watch from 7 years ago. "He hasn't spoken a word in 6 months. He wets his bed every night at 3:00 a.m. And in 28 days, the council strips Jinwoo of his leadership if the heir cannot stand before them." He held the shattered door open. "He needs you." Rita's thumb traced the handle of her tea mug. A single hairline crack ran down the ceramic. The rain had stopped, leaving the courtyard of the Lau compound gleaming like black glass. Rita Etim stepped through the heavy mahogany doors. Her heels struck the polished marble floor with slow, deliberate rhythm. Attorney Choi led her into the grand study. Jinwoo Lau sat behind a desk of dark oak. His hair was heavily streaked with gray at the temples. His suit jacket hung slightly loose on his shoulders. On the shelf behind him sat a clear glass case holding a pair of tiny, unworn infant shoes. On the desk beside his papers sat a cold, untouched cup of tea, a skin forming over the dark liquid. Beside him stood Madame Lau, sitting rigid in a wheelchair, her hands folded tightly over the silver head of her cane. Jinwoo looked up. He didn't speak. He reached for his tea, realized it was cold, and slowly set his hand back down on the desk. "Where is Daniel?" Rita asked. Her voice did not carry anger. It carried nothing at all. Madame Lau struck her cane against the rug. "You will address." "Where is he?" Rita repeated, stepping closer to the desk. Jinwoo slid a black folder across the polished wood. "The council elders inspect him in 28 days if he fails. Choi takes control of the estate and Daniel is sent to an institution in Switzerland." "Wets his bed," Madame Lau said, her voice dry as dead leaves. "He hides the sheets behind his wardrobe. He trembles when his father enters the room. He is broken." Rita looked at Jinwoo. "You let them do this to him." Jinwoo's gaze dropped to the cold tea on his desk. He didn't defend himself. He didn't ask for mercy. He simply opened his desk drawer, pulled out a set of legal guardianship papers already stamped with his personal seal, and pushed them toward her. "Take him to your apartment," Jinwoo said softly. "He won't breathe in this house." Madame Lau's head snapped toward her son. "Jinwoo, if he leaves this compound, the council will." "He goes with his mother," Jinwoo said, his voice flat and absolute. He did not look at his mother. He kept his eyes fixed on the empty chair across from his desk, the chair Rita used to sit in 7 years ago. Attorney Choi stepped out from the doorway, his hands folded neatly behind his back. "If the boy fails to present himself clearly to Elder Park in 28 days, Mrs. Etim, the transition of power will be absolute, and no one outside the council's line will be permitted to retain custody." The threat was clear. Rita didn't answer Choi. "Bring my son." The heavy double doors at the end of the hall opened. A 7-year-old boy stepped out. He walked with his head lowered, his left hand shoved deep inside his pocket, clutching something tightly. Rita dropped to one knee on the cold marble. Daniel stopped 5 feet away. He did not look at her face. He looked down at the hem of her dark trousers, then slowly pulled his left hand from his pocket. In his small palm lay a faded, frayed piece of red Ankara fabric. He looked up, comparing the scrap in his hand to the thin red silk scarf tied around Rita's neck. His chest hitched once. "Mommy!" Rita did not reach out to grab him. She stayed on her knee, holding her arms open, waiting. Daniel dropped the fabric and took 2 fast steps forward, burying his face into her neck. Rita wrapped her arms around his small frame, pressing her palm against his back, feeling the rapid, terrified flutter of his ribs. In the shadows behind the desk, Jinwoo watched his son's fingers dig into Rita's jacket. Jinwoo's hand reached out toward them in the air, hovered for a single second, and then slowly dropped back to his side, useless. That night in Rita's small Itaewon flat, the clock on the wall ticked in the dark. At 3:12 a.m., the sound of running water drifted from the small bathroom. Rita stood in the doorway. Daniel was standing on a plastic stool over the sink, his small hands red and raw as he scrubbed a wet bedsheet with a bar of yellow soap, gasping through soundless, dry hitches in his throat. Rita did not take the soap. She did not turn off the water. She pulled a second plastic stool beside his, rolled up her sleeves, and placed her hands into the cold water alongside his. Together, in total silence, they scrubbed the cloth under the running tap. Daniel looked up at her, his eyes wide and frightened. "We'll wash it," Rita said quietly, her voice steady as stone. "Then we hang it to dry, and tomorrow, we'll do it again if we have to. If you're watching this and your child or grandchild is going through something similar, I just want to say this quietly, you're not alone. So many loving parents are washing sheets in the middle of the night, wondering if they're doing something wrong. You're probably doing far better than you think." Because no family should have to face this alone, we put together the Complete Parent's Guide to Children's Bedwetting to help parents understand what may be happening, gently build dry night habits, protect a child's confidence, and know when professional support may help. If your heart needed to hear that today, you'll find it in the pinned comment, the description, and through the QR code on your screen. Take a moment if you need it. We'll be right here when you come back. Daniel's shoulders dropped 1/2 inch. He didn't speak, but his small hand shifted in the soapy water, brushing against hers. The next morning, while Daniel sat at the small kitchen table, silently lining up 3 wooden colored pencils in a perfect, straight row, Rita examined the prescription bottle attorney Choi had given her. She took it to a small, private clinic in southern Seoul run by Dr. Samuel, an elderly physician who had long removed himself from syndicate politics. Dr. Samuel held the liquid up to the light, shaking it slowly. "This isn't a sedative, Rita. This is a synthetic neuroinhibitor. It targets the central nervous system during deep REM sleep, triggering severe involuntary muscle contractions and acute panic spikes upon waking." Rita sat back in the wooden chair. "Choi, whoever prescribed this knew exactly what they were doing," Dr. Samuel said softly. 2 more weeks of this dosage, and the boy's motor function would be permanently impaired. Rita took the bottle, walked out of the clinic, and drove directly to the rain-slicked docks near the Han River, where Dr. Kang had agreed to meet her after receiving her decrypted message. The shipping yard was silent save for the lap of black water against the concrete. Dr. Kang stood near a rusted shipping container, his coat collar turned up against the wind. "You knew," Rita said, stepping into the dim light of the street lamp. "7 years ago, you lied about my recovery. Now you're poisoning my son." "Doctor." Kang backed away until his shoulders hit the cold, corrugated steel. "Choi holds my daughter's medical debt in Singapore. If I didn't sign those prescriptions, he would have canceled her treatment." "Who ordered the pills?" Rita demanded. "It was always Choi," Dr. Kang rasped, his breath misting in the cold air. "Madam Lau thought he was just giving the boy sleep aids. She doesn't know. Choi has been selling off the Lao shipping routes to the Busan cartel for 3 years. He needs Daniel declared unfit so the council appoints him as regent." A quiet thud echoed through the yard. Dr. Kang's eyes widened. A small red hole appeared in the center of his forehead. He slid down the side of the container, collapsing onto the wet gravel. Rita spun around. Attorney Choi stepped out from between 2 stacked crates, holding a silenced handgun draped beneath a black umbrella. He looked down at the dead physician, then raised his gaze to Rita, his expression unchanged. "You always did move too fast, Mrs. Etim," Choi said smoothly. He raised the weapon, leveling the barrel directly between her eyes. The cold steel of the silencer hovered inches from Rita's forehead. Rita did not close her eyes. She reached into her coat pocket, pulled out her phone, and held up the screen. It displayed a live digital upload bar sitting at 99%. "Doctor, Samuel has the original blood panel from Daniel," Rita said, her voice slow, cold, and entirely unhurried. "In 4 seconds, the complete chemical analysis of Choi's neuroinhibitor is sent directly to Elder Park's private server. Pull the trigger, and you execute yourself." Choi stared at her. The digital bar hit 100%. A green checkmark flashed on the screen. Choi slowly lowered the pistol. He didn't curse. He didn't display a single flicker of rage. He folded his umbrella slightly, adjusted his cuffs, and looked at her with quiet, chilling appreciation. 22 days remain, Rita," Choi said softly. "Let us see if the boy's mind recovers before his father's empire burns." He turned and walked away into the darkness, his shoes clicking softly against the wet pavement. By 2:00 a.m., inside Dr. Samuel's backroom clinic, the withdrawal fever hit. Daniel thrashed violently on the narrow cot, his hands clawing at the white sheets, his breath coming in ragged, terrified gasps. "Don't lock the door. Father, please. I'm sorry." Rita sat on the edge of the cot. She did not hold him down. She placed a cold, wet cloth on his forehead and began to sing softly, a low, rhythmic Ibibio melody from her childhood in Calabar. Her voice filled the quiet room, steady, unbothered, and warm. Daniel's thrashing slowed. His small hand reached out blindly in the dark, his fingers locking onto her thumb. He held on with desperate strength. Rita stayed frozen in that position for 4 hours, her thumb pinned in his grip, singing the same low refrain until the first gray light of dawn filtered through the dirty window glass. By 6:00 a.m., the fever broke. Daniel's grip loosened. His breathing settled into a quiet, peaceful rhythm. Meanwhile, at the Lau estate, Jinwoo sat alone in the vast, empty nursery. He sat on the small wooden chair beside the empty crib, holding the broken pieces of the gold wedding frame he had swept up from the floor 7 years ago. He held a small tube of clear epoxy, carefully fitting the jagged glass fragments back together over Rita's face in the photograph. His hands shook slightly. The heavy doors swung open. Madame Lau stepped into the room, her cane striking the floor with aggressive force. "Choi says the boy is worsening in Itaewon. He wants the enforcers sent to retrieve him immediately." Jinwoo did not look up from the broken glass. "Choi lies." Madame Lau froze. "What did you say?" Jinwoo carefully set down the glued frame. He picked up a remote control and switched on the wall monitor, pulling up a hidden street camera feed outside Rita's apartment building. On the screen, Daniel was sitting on a park bench under the morning sun. He was holding a small piece of bread, throwing crumbs to 3 pigeons waddling across the concrete. Beside him, Rita sat quietly reading a book, leaving space between them. Daniel wasn't trembling. His face was calm. Madame Lau stared at the screen, her knuckles whitening on her cane. This proves nothing. He is still weak." "Is breathing, Mother," Jinwoo said softly. His voice was cracked, hollowed out by years of silence. "Something no one in this house has done since I took this desk." Before Madame Lau could respond, Jinwoo's private phone vibrated on the table. A high-priority tactical alert flashed red. 3 unmarked vehicles entering Itaewon sector. Weapons hot. Jinwoo's eyes went dark. He stood up, pulled a heavy tactical pistol from his desk drawer, and racked the slide with a sharp, heavy metallic snap. "Stay here," Jinwoo said to his mother. "Jinwoo, wait." Madame Lau called out, her voice suddenly sounding small in the vast, empty nursery. Jinwoo walked out without looking back. In the small Itaewon park, the peace shattered instantly. 3 dark SUVs mounted the curb, tires screeching against the pavement. Masked men armed with submachine guns spilled out, moving in a tight tactical wedge toward the bench. Rita reacted instantly. She grabbed Daniel, hauled him behind a concrete retaining wall, and threw her entire body over his small frame, shielding his head and torso with her own back. "Mommy's here," Rita whispered into his hair, her voice calm even as her heart thundered. "Keep your eyes on the concrete, Daniel. Don't look up." Daniel buried his face into her chest, his small hands clutching her coat fabric. A masked gunman rounded the corner of the concrete wall, raising his weapon directly at Rita's exposed shoulder. "Attorney Choi sends his." A single, heavy gunshot echoed across the park. The lead shooter's shoulder exploded in a spray of red, his weapon clattering onto the grass. A dark sedan tore across the park lawn, slamming directly into the side of the second SUV with a brutal crunch of metal and glass. Jinwoo Lao stepped out of the driver's side, moving with violent, terrifying efficiency. He fired 3 deliberate shots, dropping 2 gunmen before they could raise their sights. His own guards spilled from behind, engaging the remaining mercenaries in a brief, brutal exchange of suppressed fire. Jinwoo advanced step by step, positioning his body directly in front of the concrete wall where Rita and Daniel crouched. A stray round grazed Jinwoo's left thigh, tearing through his dark trousers, but he didn't stumble. He kept firing until the park was completely silent. The smoke cleared slowly. Jinwoo lowered his weapon, blood seeping down his pant leg into his leather shoe. He turned around slowly. He saw Daniel trembling behind the wall, his arms wrapped tightly around Rita's waist. Jinwoo took one heavy step forward, reaching down to pick up the small wooden colored pencil that had fallen from Daniel's pocket during the rush. As Jinwoo extended his hand to return the pencil, 7-year-old Daniel flinched violently, pulling himself deeper into his mother's side, hiding his face from his father. Jinwoo's hand stopped in midair. He looked at his son's small, terrified shoulders. He looked at the wooden pencil in his palm. He did not speak. He did not ask for a hug. He gently laid the red pencil on top of the concrete wall, turned around, and limped back to his car, his blood leaving a dark trail on the green grass. Rita watched his limping figure step into the sedan and drive away alone. 2 days later, Rita brought Daniel back to the Lau estate for the final 48 hours before the council evaluation. She moved him into the master bedroom, locking the heavy mahogany doors from the inside. She did not sleep. She sat in the armchair beside the door, her eyes fixed on the entrance, her hand resting near a heavy iron fire poker she had brought up from the hearth. On the second afternoon, Daniel stood by the large floor-to-ceiling glass window, looking down at the courtyard where 3 gardeners were quietly sweeping dead leaves into small piles. He turned to Rita. "Mommy," he said softly. Rita stood up instantly, her body tense. "What is it, my love?" Daniel pointed to the brass latch on the balcony door. "I want to open the window." Rita froze. Her chest tightened with intense, suffocating panic. Her mind flashed to 7 years ago, the balcony, the crowd, the disgrace, the cold rain. "No," Rita said quickly, her voice tight. "It's too cold outside." Daniel looked at her. He didn't cry. He simply looked at her hands, which were gripping the arms of the chair so hard her knuckles were white. "Shaking, Mommy," Daniel said quietly. The words struck Rita like a physical blow. She looked down at her hands, then at her 7-year-old son, who was watching her with quiet, gentle concern. She realized in that terrible, quiet second that her own terror was becoming the new prison walls around him. Rita took a deep, shaky breath. She forced her fingers to loosen. Slowly, step by step, she walked across the room, reached out, and unlatched the brass handle. She pushed the heavy glass door open 3 inches, letting the crisp autumn wind fill the room. Daniel smiled softly, stepping close to the opening to feel the cold air on his face. Rita stood behind him, placing her hand gently on his shoulder, letting her own fear melt into the cold wind. That night at 11:00 p.m., Rita walked down the quiet, dark corridor toward the kitchen to fetch a glass of warm water. As she passed Madame Lau's private quarters, she noticed the door was slightly open. A thin beam of yellow light cut across the dark floorboards. Inside, Madame Lau sat in her wheelchair before a tall vanity mirror. She had removed her formal hairpins, her thin gray hair hanging loosely around her shoulders. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably as she tried to apply a soothing ointment to her knees. On the vanity lay an old, faded black-and-white photograph of a young Madame Lau, standing rigid beside her own mother, a harsh, unsmiling matriarch who held a heavy wooden cane. Madame Lau winced in severe pain as she pressed her frail fingers into her damaged joint, a single quiet tear leaking from her aged eye. "I kept the line unbroken, Mother." Madame Lau whispered to her reflection in the dark room, her voice thin, fragile, and utterly broken. "I made them hate me so they would be strong enough to survive you." Rita stood in the corridor shadows. She didn't enter. She didn't offer comfort. But as she watched the terrifying matriarch weep silently before her own childhood ghosts, the monster vanished. All that remained was an old, dying woman trapped in a cage she had spent her whole life building. Rita turned and walked silently back to her room. The next morning, dawn broke over the estate, casting long golden light across the master bedroom floor. Rita sat up in the armchair. Daniel was already sitting on the edge of the bed. Neither of them spoke. The room was absolute silence for 30 seconds. Slowly, Daniel reached down, took the edge of the heavy velvet duvet, and pulled it back. The white linen sheet beneath him was pristine, crisp, and dry. They had forgotten to check at 3:00 Daniel looked across the room at his mother. A slow, quiet smile spread across his face, unburdened, light, and whole. Before Rita could reach him, the heavy master suite doors were unlocked from the outside and thrown open. Madame Lau entered, accompanied by Elder Park, 3 members of the Syndicate Council, and Attorney Choi, who stood at the rear in a sharp gray suit, his face an unreadable mask. "The hour has arrived," Elder Park announced, his deep voice filling the room. "The heir will step forward for the council's assessment." Attorney Choi stepped forward smoothly, raising a hand. "Elder Park, before the physical check, I must report a severe breach of protocol. This woman, an outsider, has been altering the boy's routines. The boy is unstable." Choi signaled 2 heavy guards standing by the doorway. "Remove her from the premises immediately so the council may conduct a proper isolation test." 2 guards stepped toward Rita. Before they could take 2 steps, 7-year-old Daniel dropped from the bed. He did not run behind Rita. He walked firmly across the hardwood floor, stopping directly between the 2 massive guards and his mother. He raised his head, looking straight into the eyes of Elder Park. He did not tremble. He did not cry. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out the gold signet ring his father had given him days ago, and held it out in his small palm. "My name is Daniel Etim Lau," the boy said, his voice ringing out clear, steady, and unbroken through the grand room. "And this is my mother." A heavy, suffocating silence settled over the room. Elder Park looked down at the 7-year-old boy, then at the gold signet ring held steadily in his small hand. The gray-haired council leader slowly bowed his head in quiet recognition. Rita walked forward, placing a small metal flash drive onto the wooden table beside Elder Park. The complete financial ledger of the Busan cartel transfers, decrypted from Attorney Choi's personal server by Dr. Samuel. Elder Park picked up the drive, sliding it into his tablet. Within seconds, rows of encrypted bank records lit up the screen, detailing Choi's direct payments for the neuroinhibitors and his planned handover of the Lao shipping lanes. Elder Park's face turned to stone. He looked up at Choi. "Seize him." Attorney Choi's expression didn't change. Seeing his play was dead, his hand slid smoothly toward his inner jacket pocket. Jinwoo stepped from the shadows of the doorway like a mountain falling. He grabbed Choi's wrist, twisting it downward with brutal force. A silent pistol clattered onto the floorboards. Jinwoo slammed Choi face down against the heavy oak table, pinning his arm behind his back until the guards rushed in and heavy steel cuffs snapped around Choi's wrists. Choi did not scream or bargain. As he was dragged past Rita, he paused for a fraction of a second, meeting her eyes with a cold, respectful nod before disappearing down the corridor forever. In the corner of the room, Madame Lau sat in her wheelchair. She looked at Daniel, who was still standing tall in the center of the room, then at her son Jinwoo, whose arm was still bleeding through his dark jacket from 2 days ago. Madame Lau slowly released her grip on her silver cane. The cane fell onto the oriental rug with a soft, dull thud. She closed her eyes, letting her back slump against the chair, looking old, tired, and finally finished. Elder Park turned to Daniel. "The council recognizes the heir. The title remains with the line of Lau." Jinwoo stood by the desk, breathing heavily. He looked at his son. He did not step forward to claim a hug or a thank you. He simply stood there, accepting the distance he had earned. 30 days later, the autumn sun shone softly over the grand courtyard. The estate gates stood wide open, guarded no longer by tactical squads, but by quiet administrative staff. Jinwoo stood at the top of the balcony steps, wearing a simple dark suit without his traditional syndicate pins. Beside him stood Rita and Daniel. Below them gathered the family elders, regional managers, and staff. Jinwoo did not make a long speech about power or legacy. He pulled a signed legal document from his coat, the complete transfer of the Lau family's maritime holdings into an independent public trust, managed jointly by Rita Etim and an international board of child protection advocates. "Power without protection is merely violence," Jinwoo said, his voice echoing across the quiet stone courtyard. "This estate will no longer build weapons. It will build safety." He turned to Rita. He didn't ask for her to move back into the master suite. He didn't ask her to be his wife again. He slowly knelt on one knee on the cold stone balcony floor, the exact spot where Rita had been humiliated 7 years ago, and bowed his head deeply to her. "Thank you for saving my son," Jinwoo whispered. Rita looked down at him. She did not touch his shoulder. She did not tell him all was forgotten. "Stand up, Jinwoo," Rita said softly, her voice peaceful and whole. "Daniel is watching." 2 months later, the morning sun cast a warm gold light over a quiet public elementary school in Itaewon. Children were running across the green grass, kicking soccer balls, and laughing as the morning bell chimed softly in the distance. Daniel stood near the yellow iron school gate, wearing a blue backpack. A small boy ran up to him, holding out a bright red soccer ball. "Hey, come on, Daniel. We need one more player." Daniel looked back toward the fence. Rita stood outside the school gates, wearing a simple beige cardigan, her braided hair tied back loosely. Daniel smiled, a wide, bright, beautiful smile. He waved his hand high in the air, turned around, and ran happily onto the green field with his friend. Rita pressed her back against the cool iron fence. Tears filled her eyes, slow, quiet tears that flowed freely down her dark cheeks. They were not tears of shame, pain, or survival. They were the peaceful, quiet tears of a mother who had finally brought her child home. That evening, the sun set over Seoul, painting Daniel's small bedroom in soft indigo and gold. Daniel was fast asleep, resting peacefully beneath a light cotton blanket. His breathing was slow, deep, and steady. His right hand rested outside the duvet, his small fingers relaxed and open on the mattress. Rita stepped softly into the dark room. She did not check the sheets. She knew they were dry. She knelt beside the bed on the wooden floorboards, looking at her son's peaceful face under the quiet moonlight. 7 years ago, in the freezing rain outside the grand iron gates. His tiny fingers had slipped from hers, leaving only a piece of torn cloth. Rita reached out slowly. Gently, carefully, she laid her warm palm over his small, relaxed hand, her fingers weaving softly between his. Daniel didn't wake up. His small hand simply tightened slightly around hers in his sleep, holding fast. They didn't slip. Outside the window, the night was quiet, warm, and still. If you made it this far, you are already a supporter of strong women who stand up for their children. So make it official. Subscribe to the channel now so you never miss a moment of this extraordinary story of courage, loss, and unyielding motherly love.